On the 8th of December, Joachim was awoken by Mamma. She ruffled his hair and said, "Time to get up, Joachim. It's 7:30, and you start school early today." He drew himself up in bed. The first thing he thought of was the magic advent calendar hanging above his head. Mamma seemed to read his thoughts. "But you have time to open the advent calendar." Joachim thought quickly. He thought so quickly that there was room for an awful lot of thoughts before Mamma went, "Aren't you going to open it then? I'd like to see it too." No, thought Joachim. He couldn't open the magic calendar while Mamma was watching. "I don't think you're properly awake yet," Mamma went on. "Perhaps you'll let me open the advent calendar today." "No," said Joachim, so loudly and clearly that Mamma jumped. "I'll wait till I come home from school. I'll have more time then." He jumped out of bed quickly to be quite certain Mamma wasn't going to start opening the calendar. "Of course you do, just as you like," she said. She went out to the kitchen while Joachim got dressed. When Joachim came home from school, a man he did not recognise was standing outside the garden gate. Since he didn't know the man, Joachim pretended he hadn't seen him and opened the gate and closed it after him. "Is your name Joachim?" asked the stranger. Joachim stopped on the path that Papa had almost cleared of snow and turned towards the man. He was quite old. He looked kind too. Joachim didn't like someone he didn't know to know his name, but he had to answer. "Yes," he said. "That's me." The man nodded. He came right up to the gate and leaned over it. He was wearing a green felt hat. "I thought so." He had a rather odd accent. Perhaps he wasn't Norwegian? "You've been given a fine advent calendar, haven't you?" Joachim gave a start. "How did you know that?" "A magic advent calendar," answered Joachim. "A magic advent calendar, yes. Price 75 €. My name's John. I sell flowers at the market." Joachim stood stock still, without saying anything. In his advent calendar, he had read about people who had suddenly seen an angel. Now it was almost as if he was being visited by an angel himself. He knew this meeting with the flower seller was important, and he wanted to say something serious, but he only managed, "How did you know where I lived?" John chuckled to himself. "Good question, my boy," he said. "I often go into the bookshop, you see. I like it there. I wanted to hear where the old calendar had ended up. It was a good thing your father forgot his driving licence. If he hadn't, it wouldn't have been much difficult for me to find you. But I expect you'd have come down to me on the market sooner or later. Don't you think so?" Joachim nodded. He had thought of it. "Did you know there were some pieces of paper in the advent calendar?" he asked. "If there's anyone in the whole world who knows, it must be me." "Now you know too," said John. "Is it homemade?" "Completely homemade, yes, and very old, but that's an old story too. Have you opened the calendar today?" Joachim shook his head. "I have to do it when Mamma and Papa aren't looking, because I don't want them to know about the pieces of paper. I'm going to pack them up on Christmas Eve and put them under the Christmas tree." "That's a good idea," said John. "But what about yesterday then? Didn't the pilgrims take a sheep with them from the old castle on Finn? And the angel Epheriel had to say, 'Be not afraid,' to the sentries at the castle." Joachim was almost scared, because John knew all about it. "Did you make the magic advent calendar?" he asked. "Yes and no." Joachim was afraid he might go, so he quickly asked another question. "Did it all really happen, or did you make it up?" John looked serious. "It's all right to ask, but it isn't always so easy to answer." Joachim said, "I wondered whether Elizabeth in the magic advent calendar was the same Elizabeth whose picture is in the bookshop." "So he told you about the old picture too," said John, sighing heavily. Well, I have nothing to hide any more. I'm too old for that now. But it isn't Christmas yet, so we better talk about Elizabeth another time." He took a step back. "Sabbath, Tebas," he mumbled to himself. Joachim didn't understand that, but perhaps he hadn't meant to hear it. Finally John said, "I must go now, but we'll meet again, for that old story links us as human beings together." He walked away rapidly and soon disappeared. Joachim was annoyed that he hadn't had time to ask more questions. He ought to have asked whether the big calendar picture was gradually changing as he read the pieces of paper. He hurried into the house and opened the door with the number 8 on it. Today was a picture of a shepherd carrying a lamb on his shoulders. Joachim picked up the paper, smoothed it out carefully, and read. On one of the last days of the year, 1499, after Christ, 4 sheep, 1 shepherd, 1 king of the Orient, 1 angel, and a little girl from Norway flocked out of a boat that he had bought them across the little belt to Jutland. "Thank goodness!" exclaimed Caspar as they stepped on land. "Yes, it'll be a long time now before we have to do that again," replied Joshua. The angel Epheriel nodded. "Verily I say unto you that there will only be one more time before we get to Bethlehem." Elizabeth had no idea what they were talking about. "Isn't it still terribly far to Bethlehem?" she asked. "Yes, indeed," said the angel. "It is far, and many hundreds of years too. But there is only one more stretch of ocean to cross. That won't happen until we get to the Black Sea." A little procession came to a town at the inner end of the fjord. At one end of the town stood a large fortress. "This town is called Kolding and is in South Jutland," said the angel Epheriel. "It has been an important trading place for hundreds of years. The fortress is called Kolding House, and the kings of Denmark have often lived here. The time is 1488 years after the child's birth." Joshua struck the ground with his crook. "To Bethlehem? To Bethlehem." They came to the top of a little ridge with fine views over the countryside. Fresh flowers were growing everywhere, so it must have been in early summer. Elizabeth pointed down to the ground as she ran. "Look at all the lovely wildflowers," she said. The angel nodded mysteriously. "They are a part of the glory of heaven that has stayed down to earth," he explained. "You see, there's so much glory in heaven that it can easily spill over." Elizabeth pondered over the angel's words and hid them in her heart. Suddenly, the shepherd stopped and pointed at the little flock of sheep. "A lamb is missing!" He needed to say no more, for all of them saw that the earth seemed to have swallowed up the lamb with the bell. "Where is it?" exclaimed Elizabeth. "The lambs are so charming with their white fleece that they're delightful to the eye. But they're almost uncontrollable," said Joshua. "It doesn't always help to put a bell on them either. If I'm watching one lamb, the other will suddenly vanish. And when I find the second lamb, all of a sudden the first one will decide to leave the flock." Shepherding is a difficult job, and it's especially difficult to herd a flock of sheep all the way to Bethlehem. As it is written, "Now I must leave the other sheep to look for the one lamb that went missing." Elizabeth felt her eyes fill with tears. But just then a man appeared over the crest of the ridge. He was wearing clothes exactly like Joshua's, and on his shoulders he was carrying the lamb with the bell. "He's one of us," said Epheriel. The man put the lamb down at Elizabeth's feet. He held out his hand to Joshua and said, "I am Jacob, the shepherd and the second of the shepherds in the field. Now I can help care for the flock that's going to Bethlehem." Elizabeth clapped her hands. Joshua struck the ground with his crook and said, "To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem." The 2 shepherds ran behind the little flock, with Caspar, the Black King, the angel Epheriel, and Elizabeth behind them. As they were passing the old market town of Flensburg, the angel Epheriel said, "The time is 1402 years after the birth of Christ. We shall soon be crossing the frontier into Germany and diving down into the depths of the Middle Ages." Joachim stood lost in thought. The angel Epheriel had said that the wildflowers were a part of the glory of heaven that had strayed down to earth. because there's so much glory in heaven that it can easily spill over. Probably only a flower seller could write something like that. He didn't tell Mama and Papa that John had visited him. If he told them about that, he would have to give away the secret of this great paper too. Joachim now had so many secrets to keep that he felt his head could split at any moment.